kind of nice. Adds a little, adds a little visual difficulty into our mornings too, which I appreciate. It makes you think first thing.
Do you think it's all ready?
Yeah, I think we're ready to go. And this mic's on if she likes it. I'll ask if she wants the lapel mic, I think, before we start.
All right. Good morning, everyone. While Fran might get mic'd up or not, I'm very happy to see you all here. Welcome to the first talk of two today with really cool cyber infrastructure ladies. There's, of course, Fran Berman, and I'm going to introduce her in a moment. And then there's also Elka Altintas from the San Diego Supercomputing Center this afternoon at 1:15. So if you like what you see here, I think you would also like Ilka's talk. Coming over to Fran Berman, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. It's actually interesting that we can get Fran to come here because one of the secrets is, can I tell? Her son is here at IU. So this was my claim to fame to finding this out. And I'm like, well, then you have to come visit us. And I want to know more about your work anyway. And the moment we discussed this was actually at the Santa Fe Institute in a beautiful setting at an event that talked about how to use these infrastructures to do learning analytics to understand better how people learn. And I think there's a lot of data coming now out of learning management systems and out of other databases which are important for understanding how to generate the workforce of the future and how to keep US companies and companies worldwide on the cutting edge, not the bleeding edge, so that they have the skills and expertise they really need for their work. As you might have read, Fran Berman is the Edward Hamilton Distinguished Professor in Computer Science at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. We recently had Jim Handler present here. It's all an amazing team they have created there. She was the inaugural recipient of the ACM IEEECS Ken Kennedy Award for influential leadership in the design, development, and deployment of national-scale cyber infrastructure. In 2015, she was nominated by President Obama and confirmed by the US Senate to become a member of the National Council on the Humanities. So she really is bridging between humanities and cyber infrastructure design and setup and deployment and usage. You might also know that she is the former director of the San Diego Supercomputing Center and also former vice president for research at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. In 2012, she became the US lead of the Emerging Research Data Alliance. So I know many of us here at ZEISS have a deep interest in DataNet and other data infrastructures that exist now in the US and worldwide. And so I think there's a lot of discussion potentially there also. And in her work, she very much supports community-driven international efforts to accelerate research data sharing worldwide and to develop the technical, organizational, and social infrastructure needed to support data-driven innovation. And so it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. I'm looking forward to spend quite a bit of time with you today. And please tell us more about civilizing the Internet of Things.
I have to put this down for my height. Well, and it's a pleasure to be introduced by Katie, who is no slouch herself. So thank you very much for inviting me. And it sounds like I can't keep a job, doesn't it? It's like really strange. Anyway, it's a long career and it's been a really fun one. Today, I just wanted to more or less discuss with you the world we're all getting into and the world we're all in, which is a world where we're emerging from the internet to the Internet of Things. And it's scary, it's thrilling, it's going to impact everything we do, it's going to impact everything our kids do. My son, honorable postdoc in mathematics here, and who's really enjoying IU, so thank you very much for creating a great culture for him. But this is something that should concern and in some sense spur us all and spur us all to action. So let's start talking about this a little. And I'm just warning you now, this is a talk with almost all questions and almost no answers. So this is answers we'll have to come up with as time goes on. So, for those of you that want a definition of the Internet of Things, just to get us all on the same page, Wikipedia, our good friend, donate now, not involved with them, is a network of physical objects. They are exchanging data all over the place, hopefully in an interoperable and a smooth way. This is a genie that will not go back into the bottle. They predict that by 2020 there will be 31 billion or more things connected. Those things are devices, they're systems, they're smart toasters, they're self-driving cars, they're all kinds of things. And the vision is pretty exciting. So the vision of the Internet of Things is one of enormous promise. The idea is to take all of those things to really empower people through technology and technology through intelligence. And if you think of all of the scenarios that we've started thinking of for the Internet of Things, things like robots being able to go into really toxic environments and help save people, RFID-enabled cows and crops and everything else, self-driving cars, robotic surgery. And you're really talking about a whole spectrum of adaptive systems, customization, monitoring, efficiency, smart technologies to keep us safe, to make life more efficient, to optimize for us, and to really create a much, much better environment. At the same time, that's not exactly what we're experiencing. And the emerging reality of the Internet of Things is you're seeing many more opportunities for fraud, misbehavior, lack of security, and in some case, catastrophic scenarios. We're seeing, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, self-driving cars and ways in which the technology is not meeting unanticipated consequences. Microsoft created a chatbot to be a friend for youth. It was modeled after a 19-year-old young woman. Trolls basically turned it through its learning technologies into a Nazi in 16 hours, and then it was sort of pulled off the internet. So we're seeing people hacking baby monitors, pacemakers, smart refrigerators, taking down the internet. Many of us, not me, but many of us have Alexa or Nest in your home. They can be hacked. The data is not private, etc. So when you think about the Internet of Things, you think about this wonderful concept of what it can be. You could also think about sort of these emerging problems with it. So which is it? Is the Internet of Things kind of a future utopia? Or is it a tech dystopia where, awful looking robots, why do they always look like this? Come and sort of take things over and kind of make the world a more difficult place. And, it's a real question, and it's a question that we have a lot of influence over at this point in time. So the first thing to realize is we have been here before. So, if you think about, way back to the Industrial Revolution, which really transformed society, it was the introduction of, ironworks and modern factories and urbanization and all kinds of things. And it really changed the way people lived in their environment, in their world. And what we typically see, and what our social science colleagues tell us, is that technological advances, of course, precede the social impact and ethical guidelines that we need to create to sort of make them all come together. That just makes sense. We sort of start understanding the impact these things will make, and then we put the societal guardrails around them. And if you think about the Industrial Revolution, you've got the rise of, not just factorization and urbanization, but there was new workforce opportunities. There were new things that were required. It was the first time you saw manufacturing at that scale. There was a growth in income and standard of living. And it's the first time you saw some modern laws, child labor laws, the first kind of environmental laws, etc. So you see the whole social and environmental ecosystem really surrounding the technological innovation grow with it, so we can create a different kind of society. And that's what we're experiencing now, and that's what we need to do now. So for the rest of the talk, I want to talk not so much about the technological innovation, of which there is amazing technological innovation in the Internet of Things, but in a sense, how that interplays with the social impact and the environmental impact. Because what we really want is a world where the Internet of Things supports, the public good, planetary sustainability. And what we really need to do that is a framework that's sort of equivalent to, you must be this high to ride the IoT, right? There should be rules and regulations and policies that help us get there, that help evolve and guide our technological innovation, that make sure that we're protected and our planet's protected. And I'll tell you right now, that's really, really hard. And we don't have that yet. And it's something that we are all going to have to work on, and our students are going to have to work on, and their children are going to have to work on. But it's something that we need to start working on now. And that's going to be really important. So let me start. I'm going to go through each one of these three things and sort of talk about the other two, how the other two impact them. And let's start with environmental impact. So a question we might want to ask is the IoT going to be good for the planet? What's the carbon footprint of the IoT? And, that has a lot to do with, how we're using planetary resources. Are there rare materials that we're going to use up? Are we going to drown in e-waste? Is it going to be better for the planet? Is it going to be worse for the planet? And so, that's an important thing because, if the IoT is not good for the planet, it doesn't make for a very good IoT. So, if we ask for the question, will the IoT be good for the planet? The answer is not so far. So, if you look at this, rather concerning picture of e-waste, it's not surprising that we have more e-waste, electronic waste, than we used to, because we have more people, we have more devices per people, per person, we have shorter device replacement cycles. Maybe you've traded in your dumb refrigerator for a smart refrigerator, and then maybe you're going to trade in your smart refrigerator for a smarter refrigerator, and maybe you're going to trade that in for a genius refrigerator. We have increased power consumption. We have an increasing number of phones that we've discarded, and laptops, and sensors, and appliances, and all kinds of things. And if you try to quantify the size of the problem, you can see how scary that kind of is. Statistics show us that there were just under 50 million metric tons of e-waste generated in 2016. Only 20% of those were recycled. Only 2/3 of the world's population is covered by e-waste legislation. So that means in the rest of the places those people live, there's no legislation saying you need to recycle, or you need to do this, or you need to do that. There's a lack of reliable data about the size of the problem. Right, so only 41 countries collect international statistics on e-waste. And so we can't even figure out, how big is that problem going to be? And if you kind of see this graph about existing and sort of predicted sizes of the problem, you see it goes up, up, up. So in the IoT, we're really going to have to keep our eye on this and make sure that e-waste is not problematic. On the other hand, you can say, wait, Fran, the IoT has incredible promise for sustainability of the planet, and that's true. So, yes. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. I do not know why. I mean, if you think about environmental laws, your mileage varies certainly by jurisdiction. And sometimes that means by state, sometimes that means by, county, certainly differs by country, the federal laws. And then not only does the mileage vary by the actual laws, but they vary by enforcement, right? So sometimes you have laws and nobody bothers enforcing them, et cetera. So, do I know the actual answer? Those are trends that probably go into it, but I do not know why. Good question, and feel free to interrupt me at any time for any question. So let's get to the good news, right? So there's also good news. And if you think about Indiana, and I lived here for a while myself in Lafayette at the beginning of my career, which was really fun. I was surrounded by, corn farms, right? And if you think about, agriculture in this country, each farm that is using these technologies becomes a little version of the Internet of Things. And this is, you know, a really amazing technology that's very helpful for the environment. So, you know, what you can do through GPS technologies and through perhaps sensors on individual planets and a mechanism that figure out the weather at that exact place, location in your field, is you can use varying amounts of water and fertilizer and pesticides and chemicals to specific crops. If there's a place in your field that, you know, isn't going to yield much, you don't have to spend, you know, many of your resources on it. If there's a place in your field that's going to yield more and it needs more nitrogen or less nitrogen or more fertilizer or less fertilizer, you can figure that out. And they've got harvesters and combines and all of that, trying to figure out how to create those kind of variable technologies. So all of these technologies have been really useful, and the Department of Agriculture has been trying to create a sense about which technologies are working on which farms. And it's not just good for the environments, it's also, once you've got the sunk costs of the actual technologies, saving farmers money per acre and per crop. And so here is some statistics from the corn. What you'll notice is that, you know, in all cases, the various technologies are helpful in terms of saving money. But you have to beware a little bit about statistics and this, because these data sets are really complex. Hey, the farm size varies, right? So larger farms are more likely to be able to use these technologies effectively than, say, smaller farms. Which technologies they use matter. The adoption rate in their community matters. The sample constituencies for each technology vary. And again, it's not just the size of the farm, but it's what they're growing and what their situation is. Sunk costs vary. So, you know, if you look at these, it's not the same. It's not an apples to apples comparison necessarily. But if you look at the report that this graph and these kinds of graphs come from, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is tracking pretty carefully all of those different parameters. And it's really interesting to see sort of how much this is benefiting the earth, and it is benefiting the sustainability of the earth. So, you know, which is it, Fran? Is it, you know, more environmentally friendly or less environmentally friendly? And the answer is, you know, with all IoT things, your mileage varies. And so what can we do? And, you know, I'd like to try to give an indication of like what we can do to sort of improve things as time goes on. And from a technical design and a business perspective, one thing we can do is to look at all of the devices that we create, whether they're for agriculture or manufacturing or something else, and look at designs that are going to work with the Internet of Things that have longer lifespans. Right? We don't want to throw this stuff out and contribute to the e-waste. So we want to avoid disposable batteries. We want to avoid disposable equipment. One way to get there is to think about upgrades in software rather than hardware, right? So if I want to go from the smart refrigerator to the Genius refrigerator, it would be great if that's just a change in my program, right? And not throwing out my refrigerator and getting a different refrigerator. That would be a good thing. We actually don't do those things with our computers, right? You know, typically we upgrade in software and they become better computers for us. At some point we have to, you know, throw out the hardware, but it would be nice if they have longer lifespans. The end-to-end supply chain, you know, thinking about sustainability all the way through that supply chain is really important as well. And then, of course, you know, there is a job here for our legislators, because at the end of the day, in my opinion, you know, government is to support the public good. And so, you know, one thing they can do is sort of create laws and policies and regulation that keep us safe and secure. This is what OSHA is all about. If you work for someone, there are OSHA rules that make sure that, you know, you wear goggles in dangerous situations or other kinds of things. And so, you know, in this situation, you can make laws. I mean, you know, some of us remember life before recycling. And, you know, it was different, but, you know, due to recycling laws, it's just become ubiquitous and pervasive. And so we can minimize e-waste. We can develop standards for what we expect for the safety and security and sustainability of our stuff. We can collect reliable data so we understand how big the problem is or how small. And, you know, all of us can raise awareness. We can, you know, go home at Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever you celebrate and talk to people in our family about how important it is to buy more sustainable products versus less sustainable products. So that's something that we all can do. And that's something we should do. Okay, so let me move to social impact. And the question we might want to ask here is, how do we guide good behavior in the Internet of Things? And when I say good, I mean not just good for the planet, but good for us as the human race. So I'd like to support the public good through the IoT. And one question you might ask, and this is not exactly an academic question, is what is the IoT? You know, what kind of a you know, thing is it? Is it a society? Is it a community? Is it a network? You know, I have various entities in the IoT which range from, you know, me to my smart toaster, to my self-driving car, to the surveillance camera, you know, all kinds of things. And all of those things have to coexist and interoperate to sort of make the IoT. And it's not an academic question because when we want to control or direct or influence behavior or outcomes in the IoT, you have to know what you're governing, right? What are we governing in the IoT? And who's accountable when things go wrong? And so here's a thought experiment. You know, what kind of laws and practice and policy do we need? So imagine, and this is probably an erroneous assumption, that the IoT is a country, right? What kinds of laws and what, you know, how would we sort of bucket all of this? And one thing to look at is the United Nations came up with something called, some folks associated with the United Nations came up with the World Governance Index. And the idea was, as you looked at sort of the Millennium Declaration, all the Millennium problems, how can we look at countries and make apples to apples comparison? And one of the things they were looking at is kind of creating buckets for the kinds of laws that countries might have. And so they're, you know, not surprising buckets: peace and security, democracy and the rule of law, human rights, sustainable development, human development. And so one of the things we might do just for the fun of it is map that onto the IoT, right? So we're going to need laws and regulations around security of the IoT. And how do we look at conflicts between conflicting things of the IoT? We're going to be looking at the design, formulation, and implementation of laws. We're going to be looking at human rights. And we're going to be worrying about that compared to vacuum cleaner rights and compared to cell phone rights and compared to, you know, toaster rights. We're going to be looking at sustainable development, and we're going to be looking at development of humans, because at the end of the day, society should help us self-actualize, right? Be better people as a group, you know, contribute to the public good. So, you know, so I'm not going to go through all of these. We don't have time for it. But I thought, let's just focus on rights for now. That's something we think a lot about. And let's think about human rights in the IoT. And so imagine the thought experiment about, you know, say you were creating a Bill of Rights for the IoT. What should be in there? We don't have a Bill of Rights for the IoT right now. And should you have a right to privacy? And if so, what do we mean by privacy? Should you have a right to access or own or delete your data? Where, how, what, you know, would that mean? Do you have a right to be forgotten? In Europe, because of the General Data Protection Regulation, you have a right to be forgotten. That actually means you have a right to be not found by a browser, right? You're not exactly forgotten, but unless you know where you are, it's like a Where's Waldo, you can't like find it. Do you have a right to opt out? In a surveillance society, which we have rapidly become and are becoming, you might not have a right to opt out. You might be involved. There might be goods and services that are mandatory for you as a citizen that you can only access online, right? You might be identified even if you don't want to be. So maybe you don't have a right to opt out. Do we have a right to prevail over autonomous systems? Am I always more important than a robot? And maybe sometimes I shouldn't be more important than a robot. If the robot needs to rescue someone from a catastrophic scenario and I want to stream Netflix, maybe the robot should win, right? So there are, you know, we're going to need to be specific about these. things. One of the laws that have been introduced in Congress, do we have a right to expect that when the government buys IoT devices, they have a certain level of security? That would be good, right? And that would sort of set the tone for everyone else. What matters to us as technologists is how do those rights get translated into stuff? You know, capabilities, software, hardware, access control policies, etc. When should devices have rights, and when should they trump our rights? When should they prevail over each other's rights, right? How do I know, you know, if my smart toaster and my smart refrigerator are having a fight, who gets to win, right? And then how do we design systems that give us a variable level of, you know, trust and privacy and control? And those are hard technical problems. They're not just societal problems. So these things are all mixing together. If you think about it, let's talk about the right to privacy. You know, we actually have some rights to our privacy. And today, your data is protected in a number of different scenarios. So now, and by the way, the enforcement varies on these. So sometimes the enforcement isn't very good, but at least by law, in the United States, your data is protected if you're a child by the Children's Online Personal Privacy Act. If you live in California, you actually have a constitutional right to privacy. And so California is really ahead of many other states in terms of IoT laws. We'll talk about in a second. If you live in Vermont and your data is shared by a data broker, they just passed Vermont H.764, which says that you need to know about it. If your data is medical information, we're all used to HIPAA rules. Your credit data is protected. Your educational data is protected by FERPA. The institutional research boards of university protect the data rights and privacy of human subjects. So, you know, we do have, and of course, if you live in Europe, your data is protected by the General Data Protection Regulation. And so we do have some data privacy rules. And by the way, sometimes we give up our privacy. So I was in Africa this fall, and when I came back, the customs officer asked me, have you been on a farm, right? Because we don't want to bring diseases into the United States that will, you know, put in danger our agricultural crops. Rob was there too. And when the custom agent said that, you know, well, maybe I don't feel like saying whether I was on a farm. Maybe I think that's private information, but that's sort of tough for me because now we've traded the public good of keeping us all safe agriculturally with my interest in privacy. So sometimes we will give up those rights and it'll be okay. And we have to decide when that is. So, you know, a place where we really don't have very good privacy in the United States is data collected on us about consumers. And there's a bunch of issues that we're seeing. So when can the government use data that's been collected about you? And we're starting to see in these few years the first cases where your home assistant and other kinds of basically IoT technologies can give up that data about you. Your Fitbit could give up the data about, you know, how much walking you've done at a time when perhaps you gave an alibi that you did a lot of walking or didn't do walking, or provide your GPS coordinates. Your Alexa can records those conversations and can give those conversations to other people, sometimes by mistake, sometimes on purpose. And really it has to do with the company policy, not the US government guidelines that say when that data is private. Sometimes your data is used for research and you don't necessarily give consent. We certainly saw that in Cambridge Analytica when that data was used to allegedly manipulate the election, right? And the legal problem with that was that it was happening with a foreign entity allegedly manipulating US elections. It wasn't that your data privacy you know, was given up by Facebook. There's no law against that at this point. For those of you that follow the highly interesting GADAR study, where sociologists at Stanford took images of people who had identified themselves as gay in both Facebook and from a dating site where your data is public, and then use that to try to figure out if they could create an artificial intelligence system that tells if you're gay compared to people. If you read the literature about it, it's really interesting because not only is the premise of the study really, really provocative, and there's a lot of discussion about the methods and whether the results were right, but think about the data privacy. If you've put a picture on Facebook or you've put a picture on your favorite dating site and you have declared your interest in potential partners, is that data private or not? And you might think that data is private, local to the dating site, but is it okay for someone to use it for research? Is it okay for your image to be used, right, in the data set? And so these are things for which, right now it's really up to the company's discretion. I thought I would give you, I have had an amusing relationship with Twitter. I've only tweeted essentially 100 times, full disclosure, but I've been sort of watching the stuff that Twitter infers about me. There's all the time they've gotten my gender right. My age has varied. When I first started tweeting, I was between 13 and 17 and over 65. Now apparently I represent more ages. I told my son about this and he said, yeah, that's about right, Mom. So, your mileage varies. My language is, let's see, the last time I looked at it, I do not know Portuguese. I wish I did. The last time I looked at it, Portuguese was off, but French was on. And then they have a number of inferred interests. And these interests are from my 100, roughly professional tweets. And so if you think about it, this is data that Twitter can share about me with anybody they like, right? And this data is not accurate. So, now I could correct it on Twitter. I mean, but I'm too amused by trying to follow this actually. But, but there's lots of times when you can't see this data and when it is being shared about you, and it might limit what you do. So for example, if your smart refrigerator is telling your grocery store, Fran needs more wine and cookies, and my grocery store is telling my insurance company that, and my insurance company is giving me higher premiums because they think that I might be an alcoholic or I might be more susceptible to getting diabetes, that's a problem for me. Where was I in all of this? And it's not so far-fetched in a situation. So all of these things matter. So what can we do as technologists? Well, there's been a lot written, an amazing amount written about privacy and anonymization. And, where this comes out is it's very hard, if not impossible, to really anonymize things. And it may not matter in some situations anyway. Cynthia Dwork has done a lot of really great stuff on differential privacy. People are looking at privacy by design. You would need infrastructure to allow yourself, if I want to control every time someone wants to share data about me for the purpose, not of the service I signed up with, but, just selling it or giving it to someone else for some other reason. Now nobody asks me if that's okay. If 1,000 people are asking me if that's okay a day, that's not going to work either. So we have to find the right infrastructure in order to have the right kind of control about this. And we're not there yet. This is a problem we all need to work on. Technology implications, as someone who's worked for a long time in stewardship and preservation of data, there's an incredible number of really, really important things we have to figure out. Where should your data live? Does it just live inside the company? Does it live in some other place? Who has access control and usage rights to that data? How long does it live? When can they get them? Who can we expect to save that data and preserve that data, and under what circumstances? What are the retention policies? If my data is if I'm a pilot of an airplane and my data is in the black box, it has to live for decades, right? The average website on the internet lives for months. So we have to really figure out whose responsibility for that. Who should pay for all that infrastructure? Anything we're not paying for really means that we're the product in the consumer section. So, whose job? And for those of us in the university, it's really hard to pay for infrastructure. The research agencies don't like to pay for it unless it's in service of, new ideas or innovation. The universities are strapped. It's really hard to get infrastructure paid for. And then, of course, all of the research or a lot of the research we want to do, if we want to do open science on the Internet of Things or reproducible research, how do we make sure those data sets are things we can actually use? And so all of those are problems in terms of stewardship and preservation and use of the data, care of the data, feeding of the data, et cetera. Okay, so again, we don't have to start from scratch. There are some places where people are trying to take this pretty seriously and have a basic framework that we can take from the federal, on the federal environment and really kind of take as a starting point. Obviously, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe comes after a really long history that the Europeans have in thinking about digital rights, especially rights of the individual, and trying to understand the impact the IoT is going to have on them, and trying to understand digital things in general. Now, note that Europe is a really different environment than the US. First of all, individuals' rights are at least as important as they are in US, and companies' rights are less important than they are in the US. So you have that framework. Also, each individual European country has much more sort of autonomy and specificity of culture than our states. So, France has its own infrastructure environment around research, and so does Italy, and so does, Belgium. And those are all really different things. And so the Europeans' job is to kind of like, put them all together in some way that's more than the sum of our parts. For us, we're more homogeneous. Arkansas and Montana and North Dakota, they have local things, but they're covered by federal laws for a longer period of time. So we have a different situation from Europe, but the thoughtfulness with which the Europeans developed GDPR would be useful for us, and the way that they prioritized. And notice that, there's going to be lots of errors, because this is the first time out. There'll be lawsuits and tinkerings with that. But this is something, we need our own federal version of the GDPR. We're starting to create that in California. So it's interesting that among all of the states, California is the closest to Europe in terms of the kinds of laws and policies and regulations and rights that you have. So they have a number of laws around the IoT and security and digital rights. You actually have a right to privacy in the California State Constitution, et cetera. So we don't have to start from scratch, but we can look at these worked examples and see what's, where is it benefiting us and where is it a liability for us? And we can see, can we, look at federal laws in that way? And this is assuming you can get the attention of folks in Washington in time for us not to be making a lot of catastrophic errors. And, Bruce Schneier, whose work I really respect a lot and has written a lot about cybersecurity, posits that we're going to have to see a lot more catastrophic stuff. People hacking your pacemaker, viruses sort of taking down the internet and in dangerous ways for infrastructure, et cetera, before we really get the attention of people. And that's probably true, given that negative things are often more newsworthy than positive things. But it's time for us to get our act together, so we should be doing that. Okay, so the last section of the talk, I thought, well, let's go to the technology itself and see how the social impact and environmental impact go. And of course, one of our favorite IoT worked examples are self-driving cars. There are self-driving cars everywhere. And just to, set our framework, self-driving cars have all kinds of ways of getting input about the environment, cameras and radar and LiDAR, et cetera. And, they have gazillion computers. For them, the road looks like this picture. And, with all kinds of things in there, and they have to keep track of what's what. They see something in the road. Is that a pedestrian who's going to be moving? Is that a police person who's just, holding up their hand? Is it a duck? That's happened too. So, what are all these things, and how can we avoid accidents, drive safely, et cetera? And artificial intelligence is increasingly used to sort of help make those decisions, right? So, let's ask a bunch of questions about self-driving cars, but first of all, let's figure out where we are. And as you all know, none of us drive cars with no automation, right? We have anti-lock brakes, we have cruise control, some of your cars park themselves, mine does not. And none of us have drones in our garages, right? That can fully do everything without us even like figuring this out. So most of our vehicles that we're driving in on the road are sort of between 2 and 4. I drove in a friend's Tesla the other day, and the car was driving us, and we're like, oh God, the car's driving us. The car was driving us, right? And the car drove us safely, so that was a good thing. You know, most of our cars are, you know, increasingly and rapidly full of these technologies. So the first thing to ask is, you know, what kinds of guardrails do we have for these? And if you look at, you know, we have much less federal legislation than we have, you know, attempts at legislation all across the 50 states. So in some places the laws have been passed, in some place we have executive orders, in some place things are pending, someplace, you know, nothing's happened, someplace nothing's even been thought of. And if you do the canonical road trip on Route 66, you know, from Chicago to LA, I'm not going to sing it, you will find that your jurisdictions really vary. So when you're in Illinois, the laws in Illinois, there's a variety of them. You know, one of them preempts against prohibition of self-driving cars. So it can't be that, you know, you're in Chicago and Chicago says no self-driving cars here. You can't do that. Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico have no legislation at all. As you pass through Texas, if you've got a connected braking system with a self-driving car in front of you, it allows you to kind of have a really close distance and go together. If you're in Arizona, it supports the testing and operation on public roads. And California has a whole bunch of laws talking about performance and testing and operations and all kinds of other things. So that's pretty cool. But imagine, you know, you have a self-driving car and every time you're in a new jurisdiction, new rules apply to you, right? And so what we need is like some harmonization of this, you know, that makes sense. It makes sense for the manufacturers. It makes sense to know what the laws are. If I want to drive coast to coast, I'm going to be in a bunch of different jurisdictions at the same time. So one of the things we have to do is really decide, what do we need our self-driving cars to do? What laws can we put, like OSHA, you know, like other kinds of laws that keep us safe and secure? Safety is important to us. You know, how safe are self-driving cars and how safe should there be? And lots can go wrong with your self-driving car. In addition to the unanticipated situation, it's a duck, not a police person or whatever. These things are not completely secure. People have had sort of high profile situations where the car can be hacked without the driver knowing about it and run off the road. These are vulnerabilities. The sensors might not work, the weather might be a problem, so the cameras aren't really seeing stuff. And so, you know, safety is really important. And and this is not a statistical survey, I routinely ask my class, how many accidents can we have in self-driving cars for you to feel like, you know, they're going to be safe? And some people say 0, right? Well, human drivers actually have a fair amount of accidents. Your risk of driving in a car crash is about 1 in 7 million, but over your lifetime, it's about 1 in 114. So, you know, those data points add up. You know, how safe are self-driving cars now? Waymo has done some statistics. It turns out that you're safer in a self-driving car if you're a teenager or you're a really old guy, right? Because those are going to do better than those two cohorts. You know, in the middle, you know, human drivers are doing pretty well. But really, I mean, the question we want to ask is, you know, how safe do we want these cars to be? The American Automobile Association has asked people, you know, are you comfortable in a self-driving car? Between, you know, roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of the people, including, you know, all age groups, say not really. You know, I'm not sure I trust a self-driving car to do okay. And generally, people think what kills you matters. There are some ways, sorry about bringing this up, there are some things that you'd rather die from than other things, right? And you know, you know, are you okay with dying in a self-driving car? Right now, our risk of dying in a plane crash, and I take a lot of planes, is about 1 in just under 10,000. And the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration says, well, if self-driving cars can cut the death toll on the roads in half, maybe people will feel more comfortable about them. We don't know. Now, of course, why would you die in a self-driving car? And that gets to ethics, right? So who should your car hit in a bad situation? And there's been a huge amount written by this. This is the trolley problem. I imagine most of you know about that. And it's based on sort of a notion of utilitarian ethics. So what's your objective function? How many, who should be saved? And, is it number of people versus, smaller number of people? Maybe I should save the greater number of people, but what if all my family members are in the small number of people? Am I okay with that? Should you kill other people before you kill yourself? Should you kill your family before you kill other people? Should you kill old people or should you kill young people? Should you kill good people versus bad people? And we're starting to see countries, and we're all sort of looking at China right now, where there is ranking of citizens for goods and services that you might have in China, right? Would that go into a utility function? And most people think this is pretty simplistic, and my feeling is that they're right. It's not really clear we can get a single ethical system for self-driving cars because as human beings, we don't have a single ethical system. All of us have different ethics, right? The idea of some people eat meat. Other people think it's unethical to eat meat. You've got, your mileage really varies to talk about, to make a bad pun. So what are some other ways of looking at it? And there's two studies I thought I would bring to your attention because they're really interesting. One is the Moral Machine study, where there was about 4 million people all over the world that responded to self-selecting study about, who you would kill. And I know it's really hard to see on the slide, but, would you prefer the car to do something or not do something? Would you save pedestrians? Would you save more lawful people versus less lawful people? Et cetera. So they asked a bunch of questions, and it turned out that in the demographics, they took country information, and that there were actually sort of 3 clumpings in the data that said there was an actual cultural impact on how people made those decisions. So that whether people lived in individual versus collective culture mattered. The demographics that were valued, almost everyone valued children. Some people value old people more than others, right? Some people value women more than men, or men more than women. Religious preferences and the kind of impact that one's religion has on, the idea of your ethics. So all of those sort of seem to make a difference. And if you think about it, we don't all have one set of ethics, and it's an interesting study to do. One way we might eventually see is there's another group, that yourmorals.org, which tries to characterize your morals. So imagine that, I buy a new car in 2030, and it says, Fran, take this test with 100 questions and ask me questions, and so my car will make the same ethical decisions that I will. And I swap it out and I say, Martina's going to drive my car. Okay, let me swap in Martina's ethical system while she does that. And, this is just a brave new world. We're all going to have to sort of figure out what this means. And it matters because people will be manufacturing these cars. People will be accountable, hopefully, when something goes wrong with these cars. And all of us will feel safer and more secure if our car is making good decisions. So here's what they're doing in Germany. So a couple of years ago, Germany did a first pass on vehicle ethics guidelines. There's about 20 of these. I don't have all 20, but some of them are really obvious and some of them are really actually quite interesting. So the really obvious one is let's try to prevent accidents when we can. Okay. Let's try to save people over property or animals, right? So that's another guideline. The next thing is that the public sector is responsible for guaranteeing safety, and that means they need policies and regulations and guidelines to talk about safety and security. But the liability, they suggest, should be the usual product liability. So if my anti-lock brakes fail, I can blame the manufacturing. If my self-driving car hits someone, maybe I blame the manufacturer. Maybe they're responsible rather than the programmer or the person in the car. so all of these things sort of have to be worked out. It should be clear who's controlling the car. If I'm driving the car versus the car doing itself, then that's going to mean something different for accounting and liability. In accident situations, and this is really interesting because given the cultural ethics of different people in different places of the world, Germany suggests that any distinction based on personal features, age or gender or, physical or mental constitution is prohibited. So you can't save, children over any other group, for example. So that's an interesting thing. They punted on the thing that we're all super worried about, and maybe correctly, because we don't yet have machines that can make ethical decisions in ways that we think we should. So they say these genuine dilemmatic, decisions can't be programmed yet, right? And then the other interesting thing is, I'll get to this on the next slide, is that business models have to respect the limitations on autonomy and data sovereignty of road users. So that answers the question, at least for Germans, about whether self-driving cars should protect your privacy, right? We're talking about the social impact of these amazing technologies. So it turns out that currently the information collected about you by your car, or in the near future, depending if you have those insurance devices or what the car collects, is a lot of information. They know where you go, they know how you drive, there are biometrics on some steering wheels, what you listen to, what you say, your conversations. And so who gets to access that information? Is that shared with your insurance company, with other cars, with companies, law enforcement? Can my car be used as a marketing tool? If I say, driving to work, let's stop for coffee, car, and my car says, okay, there's a Pete's a mile away. But, is this because Pete sent them a sponsored ad and Starbucks was, a half a mile away? I mean, that's what happens to us on the internet, right? So, can I be marketed to by my car? Can that information be used against me? If I'm having a, talk with Katie in my car and I said, God, I felt like I was going to kill that guy. And then that guy ends up dead, can that be offered up to law enforcement? When are you okay with this and when are you not? And so all of these things are stuff that, maybe they seem kind of weird and far-fetched and you say, oh, that's another Fran talk. But these are things that are really going to, start impinging on us more and more unless we are aware and unless we make them a priority as we think about the technologies we do, the laws we have, et cetera. Okay, I couldn't end up the talk without wondering about the environmental issue. And so the question is, are self-driving cars good for the environment? And the answer is not yet. Right now, they're not good for the environment. They will be, but right now, they have 20% more greenhouse emissions. They're heavier, so their fuel efficiency is less. They're not as aerodynamic as non-self-driving cars. They have all those computers and sensors and stuff on them. And so, there's a work in progress. If we want to create, and of course we're throwing out our other cars, right? So there's some e-waste. And if you think about the road that we have to go forward on, it's really important for us to think about making them, not a draw on the environment. Okay, so, let me go back to the question I originally asked. When we think about what does it mean to say you have to be this high to ride the IoT, it really means that all of those things have to be thought of in a cohesive way. We have to, when we design things, we ought to think about the sustainability and the privacy and the social environment, et cetera. Same on that. And so, I always hate to end talks with like, okay, now we need to all go out and make world peace, right? What are you going to do tomorrow? I don't know, or Monday morning. So I have some suggestions. And here's some places we can start. There's stuff that the government can do. And the first thing the government can do is they can actually conceptualize and articulate a set of rights we should be going for. We don't really know what those are now. We know what the Europeans think, maybe their digital rights should be, or what the Australians think their digital rights should be, or what the Chinese think their digital rights should be. We don't know what US folks think their digital rights should be. We should create, pass, and enforce policy, regulation, and standards that help us do that. You'll notice there's a number of bills in Congress. How does Fran say this diplomatically? Some of them are more clueful than others. We should be making and prioritizing and enforcing bills that really help provide these guardrails for us. And, you know, there's a lot of places where we have research. You know, the current research has shown us that current ways of anonymizing and making things private don't really meet the measure of what we want. You know, we need to have interesting and better ways of doing these things, and that means the research community has to be involved. Private sector can do a lot. If you're involved in a company, whether you run the company or not, you can make security, privacy, and sustainability a priority. Now, companies exist in a world where they have to make a profit or they go out of business, and if they go out of business, they're dead, right? So you don't want to kill a company, but you can make things important. And you can make these things important as you design and manufacture your products. When something goes wrong, you can, and even when stuff goes right, you can increase the transparency, explainability, reliability, and trustworthiness of what you do. And we're going to be seeing a lot of experimentation around that as our products and services have more and more artificial intelligence components. And you can respond to vulnerabilities expeditiously. And we've seen things where companies kind of hide it because they're worried or they're ashamed or whatever. We need to know about this stuff, and security and safety experts have to work on it. Okay, most important, what can you and I do? You know, we might not run a company, we might not be an elected official. You know, what can I do on Monday morning? So I'll tell you some things I think we can do. First of all, you can vote with your wallet. When you buy something, you can make good decisions. Buy something more secure versus less secure. Buy something more private versus less private. Ask about these questions. Know the risks of what you do. Know how to turn off, which is hard to do, by the way, because I'm always trying to do this. You know, turn off the things that make your data less private on your iPhone or your computer or stuff like that. You can vote with your vote. And I think we don't do enough of this. You know, our elected officials, you know, ought to know what net neutrality is, and data privacy is, and cybersecurity. They can think whatever they like about it, but they ought to make an informed decision. And I think oftentimes we don't ask them, or they don't have an opinion. And then they get to Congress and they have to deal with these rules. So whether you're running yourself or whether you're a citizen writing a letter, just alerting them that you care about it is actually a useful thing. You can influence your coworkers. If you work in a company or you, you know, are working in an organization, you know, you can influence the design of things. I can't tell you how many students I've had who are in companies who say, wow, we read all about that stuff and our company's building this product. And like, I got to ask people about what the data privacy stuff was. And you can do that in your company. It might not change the outcome, but every little bit helps. You can influence your friends and family. When you go home or wherever you go for, you know, the break, and if you go into some family gathering and you have great Uncle Joe who just got an iPhone and has no idea what to do with it, you can say, look, Uncle Joe, you know, you gotta like put these on off, right? Or don't download this, don't download a link you don't know about, or, you know, you can kind of help just raise awareness between people you know. And then, you know, at the end of the day, you can do a lot of stuff. You can write op-eds, you can go give crazy talks about this, you can involve it in your life and your research somewhere. And I think that, you know, this is not Mark Zuckerberg's problem alone. It's not the US Congress's problem alone. It's sort of all of our problem. And it's going to be really, really important for us to be activists about this, because this is our world. And it's a world that we really want to support the public good, especially over the next 10 years, 20 years, and the rest of our lifetimes. So with that, I thank you and happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
And I want to add some things that you were getting involved in. I spent my 2010 sabbatical working in Congress on the Hill in are working on bill. Last thing I want to say is there is now an open request for comments which is published in the Federal Register. That's what we were responding about updating the cybersecurity framework that was last time. So thank you for your patience.
Well, I so admire what you've done. I think the best thing, I mean, there are people working super hard in Washington to try to advance safety and security and well-being for all of us. And I think the more technologists who can all spend actual quality time there and be helpful for that are really important, because you have to understand the technology framework in which policy will sit. And then technologists have to be able to understand the social implications of what we do, and it's a two-way street. So, my hat's off to you. And my hat's off to anyone else who takes that option, even though I'm not wearing a hat.
So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I was at sabbatical at Harvard and I was running an Internet of Things project to try to put the ability to do small-scale chemical manufacturing. And so I'm in charge of 2 Harvard undergrads, an MIT grad student, and flying back here in Bloomington. And of course, being who I am, I said, what's out there in terms of regulation? Even questions like, we look at this, going, well, if we put this out into the world, somebody would start finding a highly reproducible meth synthesis. Do we need to alert somebody in the government that this is a site that you need to, there was absolutely no guidance anywhere.
Yeah.
MIT or Harvard campus, when I talked to people, I said, this is ridiculous. I've got to make all these decisions myself with these 2 undergrads and grad students as to how we develop this technology. And so we've been very careful about it, but there's a paper in Science that just came out that's very similar to what we were developing. So because we were thinking about all these things and trying to make it very secure, thinking about the ethical implications, we've been partially spooked. But what's more disturbing to me is like, why do I have no guidance as I'm developing this technology?
Yeah.
Why is it so slow to put an ethical and because the technology is going full speed ahead?
I mean, 2 things, I think there are more, but 2 things I've seen is, first of all, there seems to be an increasing set of folks kind of like from the law environment, trying to understand technological implications, and the cyber law group at Harvard is really kind of focusing on that. But the other thing I recently saw was, and if you ping me, I'll give you the website. There's like a public interest website that Bruce Schneier and a bunch of other people were putting together. And they were about people like you and like me and like, lots of others of us, who are sort of really interested in that interface. How do you get kind of the social ecosystem aligned with the technological innovation? And how do you do that in such a way that, supports the public good? And there's an increasing number of organizations and groups and committees, and not enough, pretty clearly, but I think there is more, and they're trying. The other interesting thing, and I don't know what university does this. I mean, maybe in Boston there's people who are sort of doing this on their own or at other places, but a career path for kind of a public interest technologist or a public interest social scientist. A lot what you were talking about for the AAAS does this for the beginning of your career. But what if I want to do this and I'm not at the beginning of my career? I mean, I know about the Jefferson Fellowship and other ways, but I think it's uncommon for people to be taking that, be able to take time away for your research, your family, or your kids are in a school system or whatever your situation is. But there ought to be more ways that the scientific community can really contribute. Because I think we have a lot in scientific and technologists, and that includes social scientists and humanities and stuff like that. We have, training on evidence-based decision-making. We have a lot of expertise to share. And oftentimes we're talking to ourselves about things of interest to us. But I think addressing the public is really, really important. I really believe in that. I think that maybe our most important community in the big picture is smart people who don't have our specialization, right? People who work on Wall Street, people who work in hospitals, people who work in the movie industry, whatever the the things are. And I think that's really important. And so I agree with you. And I think there ought to be more career paths that allow us to contribute to the greater society.
But even the discussion, so I was part of the self-organization. Cynthia's work was part of the former dean of the Harvard Law School. And so we were discussing this thing. The thing that, you know, one of the frustrations is there's loads of discussion. And I'm like, no, I've got to go into the lab today and design this technology.
Yeah.
And you're giving me nothing but loads of questions and no guidance as
Right.
to what I need to physically do this afternoon. And that was
Right.
that's the disconnect I see, because I could find loads of discussion, but no real concrete guidance of what I need to do with my students this afternoon.
I agree. And, you know, I'd like a checklist myself. You know, if I'm on Twitter, what am I giving away and what are you getting?
Right.
If I have Gmail, what am I giving away and what are you getting? If I'm on Facebook, you know, just take the, you know, 12 obvious things that many of us are on. And I would like to know what my, you know, I mean, I'm just assuming I'm giving away everything, right? But some of them are safer than others. Some of them are better than others. You know, we can assume that business model for all of them are advertisements, so we're the product. But, you know, if we went deeper than that and we understood it and we have those conversations over Christmas or Valentine's Day or whatever you want to celebrate, I think those are important. And I think a more aware public means that we're going to get better legislators, better legislation, better labs, you know, et cetera. But how to get there, you have to get there in small chunks. And that's why, you know, I mean, you want to start with something you can do Monday morning. You know, Monday morning, you know, I need a new X, right? Can I look at the, you know, I need a new, which I don't, by the way, baby monitor, right? Can I look at all the different baby monitors and figure out which are more hackable than others? You know, people screaming at my baby might not be a good thing. So, yeah, I think those things are important.
I think those of you which run very fast, which are on that yellow arrow, which is way over there, and then the policy is kind of slowly catching up, you're going to have that problem no matter what. So we have to get on fast in technology and science. So I'm glad that you can go and be at lunch with some friend. All right. Any other urgent questions? Otherwise, I'm going to close this up here. I'm not sure if it's busy schedule while she's at IU. And thanks all for coming. And please do discuss it and please pick some of those options that Jane pointed out in Camp Hall. And also, I would like to highlight the importance of libraries and science museums and other places that are already in place as a unique dissemination infrastructure for these kind of discussions. So, in addition to giving talks here, go out there and give small talks so to be part of the discussion in these kind of environments. More and more become community spaces where people go because they want to discuss. So thank you again, Fran, and
Thank you guys.
So yeah, it's way hard to get on the internet. I basically got the first grade, you know, rather immediately contact
How about you?
Give me your hug.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
I can't stay long. I did want to say hi. I'm leaving for Brazil tomorrow and pick up my daughter today. So yeah. So the schools are happening in Sao Paulo again. So yeah. We'll see. We'll see when the time comes. I'll actually say something about it maybe out loud next time. I didn't at all think about promoting myself or
I think that may have been because I think, you know, like, I think that salaries, there's so few voters that if someone promotes himself.
Yeah. And Larry said the exact same thing, that there are so few voters that they argue that results very widely, and I shouldn't take it to heart. I have so many things going on. So very good. But great to see you. Enjoy your time here. I get to be in a place to South America, but I get to spend today with my daughter, so that's good.
And then how long are you here?
Just a week. Yeah, so the first week is already, it's completing today.
Yeah.
So that's going without me. I'm just going in for the cyber infrastructure portion. So, yeah, great talk, by the way. It's really great to see the schools kind of entwine ethics throughout the teaching, and I think that's something that sometimes is passed over, especially in computer science education.
So I'd like to do some sort of, more deep dive writing. So that's my plan. When I'm like not already.
Right. Okay. Well, very good. Keep me updated with what you come up with. I'd be very happy to see that. And, yeah, I'll be around and probably back in the thick of things by the next election.
Cool. I'll have fun.
Rob Quick.
Oh my gosh, Rob is wonderful, Martina. You should know him.
So yeah, I've worked with Beth some, but I'm with EWaste, part of research technology section. Now I'm part of pervasive technology institute. But I have encounter friends myself that are so as I said, I'm going to Brazil tomorrow, so we do a foundational course in data science for students in low-income countries, and it really targets non-computer sciences. It targets all the other sciences too. Some foundational basis in data science because they're dealing with no data sets. So it opens up data ethics, and then some tools like
Hi.
what do they do once they're
I think that's yours. I think that's a gift we give people. I may be incorrect with the plumbing done into it, but I think it's good.